The moment I sat down at that restaurant table and saw the woman across from me visibly pregnant, 8 months along by the look of her, while my so-called friends snickered behind their menus at the bar, I understood I had just become the punchline of a joke I hadn't agreed to be part of, but by the time the check arrived that night, it was my friends who couldn't look either of us in the eye. Before we continue, if you believe in kindness and second chances, take a moment to like this video, drop a comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to Kindness Inspire, because this story is about to remind you that cruelty often reveals more about the people dishing it out than the people it's aimed at. My name is Barnaby Ellison, 32 years old, and I'd just come out of a difficult 2-year relationship that ended when my fiancée decided marriage wasn't for her after all, 3 weeks before our wedding date, no less. My friend group, a tight cluster of guys I'd known since college, had taken it upon themselves to help me get back out there, which in practice meant setting me up on a string of increasingly disastrous blind dates over the following months, mostly for their own entertainment rather than my actual happiness. I should have seen the pattern sooner, but grief has a way of making a person accept company even when the company isn't kind. The worst offender in the group was a guy named Cornelius Whitlock, the self-appointed ringleader of our friend circle, the type who mistook cruelty for humor and had never once faced consequences serious enough to change his behavior. It was Cornelius who arranged this particular date, telling me he'd met a woman named Philippa through a coworker and thought we'd hit it off, insisting he'd already spoken to her and she was excited to meet me. What he didn't mention, what none of them mentioned, was that Philippa was 8 months pregnant, and that the entire date had been engineered as an elaborate joke at both our expense, something Cornelius and 2 other friends, Desmond Fairweather and Reginald Ashby, had cooked up over drinks the previous weekend, apparently finding immense humor in imagining my reaction when I arrived to find a visibly pregnant stranger waiting for me. I found out later that they'd contacted Philippa Marchetti Solis, 34 years old, separately, telling her a similarly false story, that a friend of theirs, meaning me, was interested in meeting her for a casual dinner, conveniently omitting to her as well that this had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with humiliating us both for their own amusement. Philippa arrived at the restaurant that evening believing she was simply meeting someone new for dinner, having recently gone through her own painful separation from her child's father, a man who had left the moment she told him she was pregnant, and she'd cautiously agreed to the outing hoping it might be the beginning of rebuilding some semblance of a social life during an otherwise isolating chapter of her pregnancy. I remember the exact moment I walked into the restaurant and spotted her sitting alone at a corner table, her hand resting instinctively over her rounded belly, looking around anxiously for whoever she'd been told to expect. I glanced toward the bar, where Cornelius, Desmond, and Reginald sat 2 tables away pretending not to watch, badly disguising their laughter behind raised drink glasses. In that instant, I understood exactly what had been arranged and exactly why, and I felt a wave of anger rise in my chest, not at Philippa, who was clearly as blindsided as I was, but at 3 men I'd called friends for over a decade who apparently thought my heartbreak and a stranger's vulnerability made for good entertainment. I could have walked out right then. Part of me wanted to storm over to that bar and tell them exactly what I thought of their so-called joke. But something about the look on Philippa's face, a mixture of confusion and quiet dread as she clearly began piecing together that something was wrong, stopped me. I walked over to her table instead, introduced myself honestly, and told her the truth immediately rather than letting the humiliation stretch out any longer than it already had. I explained that our mutual friends had arranged this without either of our full knowledge or consent, that I had no idea about her pregnancy beforehand, and that I was deeply sorry she'd been put in this position by people who clearly thought cruelty was clever. Philippa's face went through several emotions in quick succession, embarrassment giving way to anger, and for a moment I thought she might simply leave, which honestly would have been entirely justified. Instead, she looked past me toward the bar, where our mutual acquaintances were failing spectacularly at hiding their amusement, and something shifted in her expression, a kind of steady resolve replacing the initial humiliation. She asked me, quite directly, whether I'd be willing to actually have dinner with her anyway, not as the joke they'd intended, but simply as 2 people who'd both just been treated poorly by people who should have known better, and who might as well make the evening worthwhile out of spite if nothing else. I said yes without hesitation, and we sat down together properly, ordering food and beginning what became one of the more genuinely interesting conversations I'd had in months. Philippa was sharp-witted, self-deprecating in a way that suggested real resilience rather than bitterness, and remarkably calm about being 8 months pregnant while sitting across from a stranger who'd technically been sent to date her as a prank. She told me about her son's father, a man who had disappeared the moment things became complicated, and about the fierce, occasionally terrifying independence she'd cultivated in the months since, determined to build a stable life for her child regardless of who had abandoned that responsibility. As the evening progressed, our conversation grew louder and more animated, drawing occasional curious glances from nearby tables, and more importantly, from the bar where Cornelius, Desmond, and Reginald had clearly expected us to either leave in humiliated silence or sit through an awkward, joke-length dinner before fleeing separately. Instead, we ordered dessert. We laughed, genuinely, at increasingly ridiculous stories, hers about pregnancy cravings that defied logic, mine about wedding planning gone catastrophically wrong 3 weeks before it was supposed to happen. The restaurant staff, noticing the shift in energy at our table compared to the tension at the bar, began treating us with visibly warmer attention, refilling drinks without being asked, checking in with genuine interest rather than obligation. If this story is touching your heart right now, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment sharing your thoughts, because what happens next reminds us that dignity, chosen deliberately, can outlast any joke meant to strip it away. By the time the check arrived, nearly 3 hours after we'd first sat down, Cornelius could no longer maintain the smugness he'd walked in with. He approached our table under the pretense of saying goodbye, clearly expecting some acknowledgement of the joke, some shared laugh at our expense that would validate the entire elaborate setup. Instead, Philippa looked directly at him and thanked him, with pointed sincerity that left absolutely no room for humor, for accidentally introducing her to someone decent, since apparently that hadn't been his intention at all. Desmond and Reginald, standing slightly behind him, shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that whatever amusement they'd anticipated had entirely failed to materialize. I told them, calmly but directly, exactly what I thought of grown men who found cruelty toward a pregnant stranger and a heartbroken friend entertaining, that whatever laughs they'd gotten out of planning this had cost them something considerably more valuable than they seemed to realize. The restaurant had grown quiet enough by that point that several nearby tables clearly overheard the exchange, and I watched Cornelius's face flush with an embarrassment he'd never anticipated feeling, having walked in expecting to be the one laughing at someone else's expense. Philippa and I exchanged numbers before leaving that night, not out of romantic interest exactly, though I won't pretend there wasn't a genuine spark of connection, but out of a mutual recognition that we'd both stumbled into an unexpected friendship worth preserving regardless of how it began. Over the following months, that friendship deepened steadily, through her final weeks of pregnancy, through the birth of her son, a healthy boy she named Percival, and through my own slow process of rebuilding confidence after a broken engagement. I was there, at her invitation, in the hospital waiting room the night Percival was born, and I've remained a steady presence in both their lives ever since, first as a close friend, and eventually, nearly a year later, as someone she chose to build a deliberate, genuine relationship with, this time without any cruel joke involved whatsoever. Before this story ends, if it moved you even a little, please comment the word dignity below, because sometimes the people who try to humiliate us accidentally hand us the very thing that changes our lives for the better. Cornelius, Desmond, and Reginald never fully regained the closeness we'd once shared, the joke having exposed something about their character I couldn't unsee no matter how many apologies followed in the weeks after. I distanced myself gradually, not out of dramatic confrontation but simple recognition that some friendships reveal themselves as smaller than we once believed them to be. What they intended as a cruel punchline instead became the origin story of a chosen family, Philippa, Percival, and me, built deliberately from two people's refusal to let humiliation define an evening that we decided, together, to reclaim as something worth remembering for entirely different reasons.